everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Diana Perry Cruz.
Did you almost say hello, Diana?
Yes, I did. Hello, Diana. It's me, Rob Perry Cruz.
What? No, that's wrong.
No.
Flip
I'm
it.
back in the Sliding Doors episode.
Oh, jeez.
You didn't even watch that movie.
Yeah, you didn't even get that joke.
No, but now I get the joke.
Oh, okay.
Now I get it.
All right.
I'm cool.
Who else is here?
I'm here, and my name is Jackie, not Perry Cruz, but McDonald.
Very nice.
Our friend thinks that's so funny. She listened to one of our episodes, and every time she sees me now, and she said it, and I forgot that we said it, she was like, "Hey, Jackie, not Perry Cruz," and I was like, "What?" And she was like, "The podcast," and I was like, "Oh, she's not a behavior analyst, so that's why it was weird. It was way out of context.
Oh, it's out of context.
yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah. But this is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss it. We do some bits, but I was told no bits at the start of the show. So this is going to be very serious.
Just chomping at the bit.
No, I would be champing at the bit, actually.
Now you've done it. Now you've done it, Jackie. Now we have to hear about how chomping at the bit is wrong.
I don't appreciate that
And
you're
champing.
like, let's not do a bit to start the podcast, and all you're doing is setting me up for bit after bit. It's not
I think it was
very
accidental.
kind. You're just used to the bit. You want to do the bit. But we're
No,
not.
I want to talk about this topic.
All right, we're talking about a topic. Every week we have a topic, and we read relevant research articles. It's very serious. There's no jokery at all. And
You don't take my advice. I don't even know my own name.
this week we're pulling out another in our possible. We've only done two of them, so this is the second one too. Our tutorial episodes.
It's actually our third one.
Is this our third tutorial?
It is our third. We did token economies. We did procedural integrity, and this is our third.
One. Oh, that's right, because we were originally going to do them as one, and then we broke them into two. Okay, sorry, it's our third one. So now it is a running series tutorial where we discuss a topic that doesn't have either as much research or that folks are very new to in the field, and we sort of lay out some of the basics. So it goes beyond the task list, but it is also meant to be more of an introductory and here are some steps to follow episodes. And this tutorial is all on working with an interpreter. So Diana, what articles will we be discussing today?
All right, for today, we have 3 articles to review. This first one is the one that made me say, let's have this be a tutorial, because it has a lot of really good concrete information for everyone. And that article is titled, Delivering Culturally Sound and High-Quality Behavior Analytic Services When Working with an Interpreter by Dowdy, Clarkson, Obidil-Malor, Tincani, and Travers, and published in Behavior Analysis Research and Practice, BARP. 2021.
Barp, 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 barp.
Can't
barp.
help it. Love it. Love BARP. Also, not to be outdone, we shall review Family Members' Experiences of the Use of Interpreters in Healthcare by Hadziabdik, Albin, Hikila, and Hjelm.
I really brought it for you in these last
I don't know
names.
how I did on those. I apologize.
They're all Swedish.
If you happen to be listening and I spelled your name wrong or said your name wrong.
They're Swedish.
Yeah, so I probably said it wrong. That was published in Primary Healthcare Research and Development back in 2014. And finally, Training Behavior Analysis Graduate Students to Work with an Interpreter by Vasquez, Lachago, and McCarville, and that was in Behavior Analysis in Practice, BAP 2024.
Okay. Well, what is everyone's experience in working with an interpreter when providing behavior analytics services of some kind?
Mine's very limited, sadly. And I think in a lot of situations where I was a behavior technician and I was working with families that English wasn't their first language, we should have had an interpreter and we didn't. Or we used a staff member to be the interpreter, which again is fine, but I think it's not...
It's different, as we're going to talk about. It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing as actually hiring someone to be the interpreter. So it felt more like, oh, you can speak this thing. Come on over.
Right.
Instead of actually planning to have someone that's being paid for that service. So that was mine. I think it's been woefully underrepresented in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Dan, how about you?
I also have relatively limited experience with this, not for the lack of working with families from a lot of diverse backgrounds and for whom English is often a second language. But similar to Jackie, there have been limited times where we've had a actual interpreter present. We've used a variety of methods to make sure that the messages are getting across, but not exactly like it's represented here in these articles, which I think may be a common experience, and why when I found this Dowdy article, I was like, oh my gosh, I really want us to talk about this because it's a really important area in our field that we need to ensure that we're doing right by and providing the right services for our clients, and everyone might not know what to do or how to do that. So that's why I want to talk about it.
I can say in preparation for this article, I had met with a lot of agencies recently, and I just asked them offhandedly, oh, do you have an interpreter on your docket? And a few of them actually said yes.
Yeah.
And the only ones that said yes were ones that were already working in lower poverty levels because they said that there was more need for it in those areas. I don't know if that's true or not, but many of the agencies said no. Yeah. They didn't have one, but they knew where to go to find one if they needed to.
Yeah, and I think regionally that may vary a good bit.
Right.
Because if it's common that you may have a large population that speaks one particular language other than English, then it may be more likely, like in the article I'm going to talk about, everyone's second language in that study was Spanish, and they also had enough graduate students in their program that they could actually function as the quote unquote interpreters because they were bilingual. However, where we live, it is a really culturally diverse area here with lots and lots and lots of different languages spoken other than English. So it might be a little bit different in how that would look. Like if it's like, oh, almost every family we meet that doesn't speak English speaks Spanish, and therefore we kind of have like an interpreter on retainer, right? That's going to be our Spanish speaking interpreter. Whereas here, it could be so many different languages that it might be a different type of setup. So at least what you're saying, Jackie, is that places have a list that they might pull from, or they've thought about where to get those services.
No one said, no, we don't have any.
Yeah.
Which was good.
Yeah.
But not many had them on, like, their, like, part of their, like, staff.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference, too, between saying we could get an interpreter or we have an interpreter and what we're going to be talking about, which is how to then work with the interpreter. Because just saying, oh, this person will be able to translate everything and just blindly going into a meeting is probably not going to be a good experience for the family or the client. If the client is able to be in the meeting, it's not going to be a good experience for the interpreter. It's therefore not going to be a good experience for you. So regardless of where you are at least in the United States, at least according to the 2011 Census Bureau, 60.5 million people stated that 60.5 million people stated that they spoke a language other than English at home. It's not the same thing as therefore needing an interpreter. Potentially they could be a multilingual household. However, that does give you a sense of the scope. About like 1 in 5 Americans could possibly have English not be their primary language and possibly therefore require an interpreter to receive appropriate services.
And it's our ethical requirement to do so.
It is.
Standard 2.08.
You made it sound like that was a question.
It
No,
is.
it is. I meant to go down. It is. I read the articles. I know it is.
Yes, it's in the ethics code.
No, I know.
To standard 2.08, communicating about services.
Jackie's dropping some knowledge on us.
Just so you all know.
It is.
And so, we're working with increasingly diverse populations as time goes on. There's really an increase. I mean, certainly here in Massachusetts and in a lot of states, we did have a lot of refugee families who were coming in from services. They were dealing with a lot themselves, and being able to have interpreters and knowing how to work with interpreters has been helpful in terms of being able to assure that we're providing the services the family is asking for, that the family understands what services they're receiving, educational services, and at least in my perspectives.
Also, I want to say, too, is that they feel comfortable with the interpreter, right? Because it's going to be a vastly different experience if they don't trust the interpreter and what the interpreter is saying. So I think that is something that we have to keep at our forefront.
Yeah. And,
yes.
In terms of interpreters, we talked about like, oh, you speak blank language, staff member, you'll be the interpreter. I mean, there are certification programs for being an interpreter, because the interpreter's job is not to, make a summary of what was said. Their job is to translate all that is being said to the family, and then vice versa. Their job is to understand what they do or do not know in terms of their ability to comprehend what we are saying, meaning it is not only their responsibility to do so. We have to help them with that job because many interpreters are not also behavior analysts. They're interpreters, and they may or may not have familiarity with any of the services we're about to provide. So that's like one more thing to give them while listening to us talk a lot. So we have to know a couple things to make sure this experience is smooth and helpful. Number one, for the family, but then number two, for the interpreter who we want to enjoy working with us just like anybody else.
Yeah. Right. You wouldn't want to say like, oh, we're going to use a DRO, because then the interpreter, if they don't know what a DRO is in English, how would they then translate
they would probably translate just DRO, and then the family would say, I don't know what that is. Right. The interpreter also would have no idea. They're just doing their job of translating.
Yes.
But that is on
It's going to be reviewed in our first article.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
So let's go in and we'll start with Dowdy. I'll kick us off. And Dowdy does an excellent job of describing. The article itself was written by BCBA, as well as professional interpreter/researcher who has provided services to English language learner families. And they took a look at the largest accreditation agencies for interpreters and their recommendations around how to best work with an interpreter. Those services are the Course Certification Health Care Interpreter Agency and the National Board Certified Medical Interpreter. And they sort of said, all right, well, what does this mean for BCBAs? How can you best provide or communicate your services in a way that an interpreter can more readily translate to a family? And they have 7 recommendations. The first is make sure you unpack your jargon. The interpreter is going to, like we said, give the original message accurately. The only sort of additional translation they might do is in terms of culturally appropriately stating things. So if there's sort of like an idiomatic phrase you use, they would try to sort of translate that. Because again, if you literally, translated something like throw the baby out with the bathwater, that's not necessarily a phrase everybody uses. Like, I don't want your services. I'd like my baby to not be thrown out. Thank you. So they would help out with that. But again, perhaps don't use idiomatic language. You're already trying not to use all your best jargon. They're trying not to add or remove anything, the interpreters. So be prepared for them to ask you to clarify things. And again, if you can just make your jargon-free talk, there's less that they now need to ask you for clarification so they can continue translating the thing you already said, which that sounds very hard to me. So bravo to interpreters for being able to hold that many lines of communication.
That does sound hard.
Yeah, that does sound hard. Can I just make a caveat too? Because I know we talked about interpreters could be many people, but this is when you're using a professional hired interpreter, not a staff member, not a family member, not some teacher that works in your school who also speaks Portuguese and your family's Portuguese. It is a professional interpreter.
Yeah, and I think that's why these recommendations are going to sound like not everyone is going to be able to do that, because you're right. If you're not a professional interpreter, there's no reason to expect that you could do these things.
But people do. I'm just going to put it out there.
No, and I think it's one thing if, say, a family member said, like, I have a family member who speaks English, I want them here to serve as the interpreter, and you just sort of know, hey, you're allowed to bring who you want to these types of meetings. But you also then need to be aware that you have to really be paying attention to how well you're explaining things, because the more you add in there, the more likely someone who's not a professional interpreter will potentially try to summarize, which means they could be saying the wrong thing, not on purpose or maliciously, but they're not trained to interpret the same way.
That's what we'll talk about in my study.
Yeah. Again, you need to be able to use simplified sentences, keep it short, and then pause so that the interpreter can translate, pass the information on to the parent, pay attention to, is the parent understanding? Are they making, facial expressions like, I still don't quite understand what you're talking about? So the interpreter could ask you follow-up questions. So again, the shorter you can keep it, the better. Also, like we said, don't make jokes, don't use idioms that are not going to be easy to translate for the interpreter, because that's just one more thing you're asking. And to be honest, you don't need to use idioms or jokes in explaining situations, explaining your treatment plans.
But that's depending on your interaction style, you may need to.
Right.
I think I do that a lot. That's what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. So you got to make sure you're not doing that.
Really? Because I thought you hated bits and liked to be very serious all the time.
I think you're doing a bit right now.
I am doing a bit right now.
So bitty.
I'm all about the bits. Make sure you have more time. Here's a good logistic thing. Add 30 more minutes to your meeting because you want to make sure that you are allowing the interpreter and the family time to communicate and feel comfortable in their ability to communicate with you and your ability to communicate with them. They also make the great point of, hey, guess what? If you're getting insurance funding, it's totally cool to tell the person who's going to be paying you back, this is why I need the extra 30 minutes here, and you should pay me because this is a required service. This is a federal law requirement, ethical requirement. One thing that I've seen people do this in meetings, and I want to yell at them, and it's very frustrating, is communicate to the client. Look at the client. Don't look at the interpreter. You're talking to the client. You're not talking to the interpreter. The only time you would directly talk to the interpreter is if the interpreter asks you a question to clarify what they're trying to translate that you just said.
I thought it was interesting that it said that the interpreter will like speak for the person and say like they'll use I pronouns for both their translations of you and the client, but then if they need to ask a question, they'll say, I'm speaking as the interpreter now, and jump in with that as the beginning so that you know it's their own words that are coming
I would
in.
ask an interpreter to use a silly voice when using their own language. When they're talking with the family, should be serious. When they're talking in their own voice, they should do a funny voice, and then I'll know the difference. I don't think they're going to like that recommendation.
I do not think that they will like that recommendation.
It's not recommendation number 8.
No.
Maybe they're a jokey interpreter. They like, I don't know. Make sure you're ready to clarify or repeat words. Again, the interpreter might pause, ask you for clarification, or say, could you please repeat that? And then, like you said, Dinah, they may use statements like, this is the interpreter speaking, to let you know that they are the ones who are asking for the repetition. But again, if you've been following some of those first 2 recommendations pretty effectively, they hopefully won't need to do this very much because you've been very succinct. You could consider your positioning. So could the interpreter sort of sit slightly behind the client so that the face-to-face communication is just sort of more natural for everybody rather than triangle where you're turning your head from side to side to side. Who am I looking at any given point? And that's, for everyone in that conversation triangle.
Yeah. Although you also said the interpreter might need to be monitoring what the client says to make sure that the client is understanding. But if they're behind them, that might be hard.
Well, it's like they kind of kitty corner off to the side. Like, I think they should still be able to see their facial expression decently is how I was imagining it.
Yeah, okay.
Just not in like I'm on one side of the table, you're on the other side of the table. Like the way we're sitting right now would be a bad way to do.
Our triangulation.
That's what we do that for sound reasons, not for interpreter reasons.
Okay.
And then finally, have a good understanding as a BCBA of what the interpreter's job is. There are 4 main jobs of an interpreter. Number 1 is the message converter. Relay the message of the provider and the client and help each person speak directly to the other with minimal interference from them or their own thoughts. They're also a message clarifier. They have to interpret certain things because they need to know when clarification is required for the client. They also need to know when they need clarification so that they can appropriately translate a phrase. They have to be a cultural clarifier. So again, if there's some sort of cultural misunderstanding about words or phrases, they may need to pause and explain the norm and why that's important in communication or what needs to be discussed to keep that communication going. And they also need to be a client advocate. And by client advocate, really in the sense of, I'm not sure the client is understanding, or there's some sort of misunderstanding of the way you phrase that has made the client uncomfortable. Could you please help me re-explain that in a way that is going to be clearer for them, or have the right level of kind of cultural humility with it, and just general senses of confusion. So like that, they're using too many terms. Could you please make it simpler for the client? They're not familiar with ABA or whatever the service might be, educational services or OBM potentially. Dowdy and the group then said, to continue with the process, why not use this checklist for behavior analyst and interpreter service delivery paperwork? So it's a little checklist to make sure that when you're working with an interpreter, you are all doing those jobs appropriately. And that kind of breaks it down. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. You certainly can look at the checklist yourself, but it really breaks it down into having a pre-interpretation meeting where you're discussing the expectations with the interpreter. They're discussing their expectations as an interpreter with you. What's going to happen? What are we going to be talking about? Are there any phrases or terms that you're like, I can't really break these down anymore, but I want you to know what they are so that when I explain them, you already are prepared to explain them. And then it just kind of lets you do some of those. I was going to ask this as a clarifying question in the meeting, but if we already know it might be a clarifying question, let's answer that now. You also can use that pre-interpretation meeting to talk about client cultural norms, ideally. So what are some strategies to make sure you're respecting client cultural norms? This may or may not happen, I would guess, depending on your interpreter, because I know there are some interpreters who have a lot of knowledge of the culture that they are translating and some that might have less. But again, if they've gone through the certification program, I assume that they do have more background knowledge than, say, someone who maybe just happens to know a little bit of that language, although perhaps not. And then also a chance to discuss, if you've had previous meetings with this client, any comments or concerns that have come up, just as kind of a prompt of everyone to reflect on, are we practicing appropriate levels of communication? Are we bias-free in our language? Are we showing cultural humility to the client? Then you have so it takes like 15 minutes, they suggest. They say you probably want to do a lot of these if you're, say, doing something more technical, like an FA or some sort of assessment versus, say, more basic services or sort of just like general, family consultation skills. Then you also have a post-interpretation meeting, which again is where you reflect on, did you do all of these things that happened? Did any potential communication barriers come up during the meeting? Did we all meet our expectations that we said we wanted to beforehand? If not, why? What can we do better next time? How did we respect those cultural norms? Or maybe we didn't, and how can we do it better next time? A chance to sort of think about client feedback and comments that the client made during the meeting, how they can use that to improve the process for next time. And then again, just a general sum up of like, all right, what are we going to do next time better? Kind of like take all these things we talked about. Some of the things they mentioned here were I couldn't tell if some of these steps the client was or was not present. So I think it was more of a comments the client had made in the meeting. Now you're doing your post-meeting just with the interpreter. But again, they haven't validated any of these things, but they do reflect on sort of our ongoing process of reflecting on our practice. So I think all of these sound very kind of legitimate in terms of the types of questions you ask yourself or you ask someone in terms of taking feedback to grow your ability to work with an interpreter. So if you follow all of these steps, you will have a basic ability to work with an interpreter and a means of assessing whether you did a good job or not, as well as being able to share more about ABA, which is good for dissemination purposes, with the interpreter that you are working with.
Another thing I want to point out that they didn't say is, even though we say it's part of our ethical code, the use of an interpreter is not specifically stated in the ethics code. So if a BCBA is like, well, I don't say this thing like use of interpreter in any of the standards, I don't need to use them. But it's implied when you talk about what's in the best interest of the client, when you're talking about assessment interventions results, when you're talking to third parties, right? So I think that when we're talking about, is it ethical to use an interpreter? Not everything has to be specifically stated in the ethics code in order for it to be ethical. So I think it should be part of our ethical repertoire to be using interpreters to help our families understand what we're doing. But there's not a specific, I can't be like use of interpreter 2.07, right? So I do want to say that because we are talking about this in terms of ethics.
Yeah. I mean, I always read that code as if I'm just going blah, 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 and you can't understand a word I'm saying, I'm probably not doing a very good job and not practicing my best ethics in terms of making sure that everything I say is understandable. All right, well, now that we have the basics of interpreter services down, let's take a little break. And then when we come back, let's talk a little bit about what interpreter service usage could look like in training and practice. We'll be right back.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
And we are back talking about working with an interpreter. Tutorial episode. But before we continue our discussion, we wanted to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening, you're able to earn one cultural/ethics or a cultural IBAO CEU. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or you can click on the link in your podcast player and get taken directly to our CE store. You're going to need to put in some key information, including 2 secret code words. Here's the first one, trombone, TROMBONE. It's a brass instrument, or it's a member of the brass family of instruments in the band. Captain Riker or Commander Riker loved to play one on Star Trek, The Next Generation. Jackie made a face. I was actually looking at Diana, who I thought would smile at that reference.
It's highly topical and of the moment reference.
And a very old man reference.
Hey, man, so, you could Paramount Plus has that Picard show. I bet he played the trombone on that thing. That's recent. Trombone.
Jonathan Frakes. All right. So we talked about the basics of using an interpreter, working with an interpreter. I feel like using an interpreter sounds rude. Working with an interpreter. But let's talk about some extensions of work with interpreters in terms of like training and in terms of feedback from folks. Dinah, why don't you start us off with the article you'll be discussing? Vasquez et al. Okay. All right. The article that I am reviewing is the Vasquez, Lichago, and McCarville article about training behavior analysis graduate students to work with an interpreter. And when I started reading this, I was like, we already discussed this article when Dr. Lichago was on. I went back, no, actually, that's a whole different article that's related, but this is a different article. So Dr. Lichago and her lab have been very busy. And the intro to this article covers all the same stuff that you already covered, Rob, so I'm not going to review that part of it. But what they were trying to do here was take the recommendations made by Dowdy et al. And then apply them in determining if they could teach these types of skills of working with an interpreter to ABA graduate students. And guess how they did it? How do you think they taught the graduate students?
Behavioral skills training.
Oh, ding, ding, ding.
I was going to say lots of didactic training,
just
reflection,
PowerPoint.
questions. What do you think? How does this make you feel? And, then everyone went home and did a great job.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, because that's all you need. You just need to hear it, and then you do it.
They did a 1 hour in service. They got a really exciting guest speaker like Guy Fieri or something. And he got up there and said, what are we talking about? Woo! And everyone was very excited. It's very successful.
No, actually, Jackie was right. It's BST.
Oh.
I know this is shocking because BST is very unproven.
Tell me about this BST.
Behavioral skills training or behavior skills training. I'm actually not sure if there's an AL in there or not. Just kidding. It's very well reviewed, respected, and empirically demonstrated to teach all kinds of things. And guess what? That's what they used here. And not to go ahead and spoil it, but it was effective. So the part where they do the BST kind of goes how you expect it to go in this study, but maybe the more, not to say it's not all interesting, but like the interesting part is like how they set this thing up. So what they wanted to do was identify some students in a graduate program for ABA, students who didn't have past experience working with interpreters and maybe who needed to learn some of the skills necessary based on that Dowdy study of the steps involved in working well with an interpreter. So they recruited 3 graduate students in an MSABA program via email. And like I referenced earlier, the secondary language in addition to English that was being involved in the study was Spanish. So these 3 graduate students did not speak Spanish, and they actually checked on this using something called the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages.
Ooh, it sounds so fancy.
Yes,
it's just
I know.
like I expect
I had
from
not
Europe.
Heard of that before. And so everyone involved in the study actually had to go through this process. And it scored, I think there are A, B, and C levels that you can achieve. And so these students who were the participants had to have a score of A2 or lower in their Spanish speaking, which basically means you only know as much Spanish as you learned from Dora the Explorer.
Oh. Yes, that is basically where I'm at with Duolingo and French.
Yes.
I'm at A2, 38.
Oh, does it use the same?
It does.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep, so I'm at A2, 38 right now.
Ooh la la.
In my French lessons.
Ooh la la. Mon Dieu.
Désolé. Je suis la jeune fille. That's what I learned from Muzzy.
You're a girl.
Muzzy.
Yep. Got it. Okay, so
My French friends will know that. My Canadian friends will know Je suis la jeune fille used to be a show, like a little thing you could buy as a kid.
I know Muzzy.
Yeah, Muzzy. That's what came from.
Did you know
I know
there's
Muzzy.
a Muzzy Street here in town?
There is. Anyway. I think about it every time. Okay. So, but what I don't want anyone to get confused on in this study is that there are actually 3 different types of participants. So I just told you about the graduate student participants, but there's also caregiver participants. So these are caregivers of children or adults with disabilities who are on the wait list to receive services. So they haven't interacted with the university affiliated with this study, except to say that they would be interested. And they were recruited, I presume, in like the waiting period to participate in this study. So they were there whenever there was the probe sessions, basically. There were 3 caregivers who were recruited. They all spoke Spanish as their primary language. And they also completed the CEFR for English. 2 of them scored at the lowest ranking. I don't know. I didn't write it down. A1, I guess. And then one of them scored a C2, Jackie.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
That's really good.
But she noted that she only could read English, but could not speak it or auditorily comprehend it.
That's my dream.
And I wrote down, I was like, that is exactly what happened to me in French.
Yeah.
And why when I went to college, you take a French placement exam. I placed into 3rd year French because I could read it. And so I could do the exam. And then I got into class and I could not understand a single word that was being spoken there, nor could I speak any actual verbal French.
See, I've appreciated subtitles for that because then I can sort of like I'm trying to just listen, okay, something's got to catch up. Okay, I got this now. You know, that has been helpful for trying to improve my listening skills.
In French.
En
français.
Or English.
Well, I use them all the time as well for English too. It's nice.
Let's just say when we went to Quebec, I wasn't impressing anyone with my fluency of French, though they did give me some nice pity looks of like, thank you so much for trying.
They like wait for you to finish your French and then they just respond in English. They're like, did you mean this? They're like, we.
They, you know what? I think they were taking pity on me. I think they at least appreciated I was making an effort.
Yeah, maybe. Peut-être. Okay, but I don't know any Spanish. If I were to do this in French, I would probably score like this caregiver did, where I might score well because I could read it, but I can't speak it. So they said even though she scored highly in that way, it would have been appropriate for her to have an interpreter. So she could participate in the study. And then thirdly, and I wrote these as participants. They're more like they didn't get data taken on them. So they were the interpreter participants. So these were other graduate students who spoke both Spanish and English fluently. So they identified as bilingual. They didn't have them do the CEFR in English because they participated all day long in English instruction in their graduate program. But they did have them do it in Spanish, and they needed to score a B2 or higher to function as an interpreter for this study. They all scored a C1 or a C2, so they were fine. And 2 of them had experience, like you mentioned, Jackie, of serving as an interpreter in an ABA setting. So those were our 3 groups. The ones for whom we were doing the primary dependent variable on were the graduate students who needed to learn this set of skills. And this was done in like a little room at the university, and everyone had scenarios that were given to them at the beginning. 3 types of scenarios were created: an intake scenario, a developing treatment goals scenario, and a discussion of current interventions scenario. The therapist got the scenario before the session, so they knew what kind of questions to ask. And then on the caregiver side, they didn't really need the scenario. They just said, like, respond for your own child, or you could respond hypothetically. Either way, it's fine. But they said largely they just answered for their own child, even though they hadn't started the intervention services yet. And they also said these were probably less detailed types of meetings than they would be in real life because, again, no one was actually receiving intervention, so it was a little bit of a hypothetical kind of scenario. But that's okay. And then there was a caregiver comprehension questionnaire as well. That was kind of the other component here, and I will explain more about that in a minute. So this was set up as a non-concurrent multiple baseline across participants' design, and there were 2 main dependent variables. The first one was for the graduate students. Their behavior was measured on percentage of steps for working with an interpreter. And this was based on the Doubly et al. They selected 5 things from that list, Rob, that you had presented that were going to form the basis of their checklist. They were, number 1, positioning the interpreter. Yep. Number 2, using non-technical language. Number 3, using simple sentences. And this, you think, oh, I use simple sentences, but it's more than that because you can only speak for so long and have the interpreter retain everything you said and then be able to say it back. So it was capped out at 7 seconds.
That's hard.
That's as long as you can talk for, 7 seconds. I have blown way past that.
Yeah, if you're really...
I know.
That would be very hard for you.
I know. So I was like, oh, wow. And then after 4 seconds, for one of them, they had to give her a reminder. So 4 seconds, that's all you get. Okay, so that one seems particularly challenging to me.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, so wrap it up. Number 4, speak directly to the caregiver. And then number 5, repeat or clarify what you said if it does not appear to be understood or if the interpreter asks you to do so.
Makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So those were the 5 things that they were being tested on. And
no
learning.
adding more time to the meeting because it was part of the study, so they didn't have a full meeting to worry about.
Exactly.
And they understood the role of the interpreter, I'm guessing, because they volunteered to be in the study.
Yeah, those were the other 2. They didn't include those. And then the number 2 dependent variable was the percentage of correct responding by the caregiver on the caregiver comprehension questionnaire. So I don't know about you, but immediately when I see questionnaire, I'm like, it's social validity, right? Like that's what we think. But that was actually not it for this.
It was it was listening, like a listening comprehension test.
Actually, yes. Like what did the caregiver take away from this meeting? And so at the end of every meeting, they asked them 5 questions, which were the same regardless of the type of scenario. The questions were, what was the objective of this session? What did the therapist say to do before the next session? What is the date and time of the next session? Where is the next session? What is the plan for the next session? Okay. So then they graded them on those questions. So it was just to see, did they actually take away the right pieces from the meeting? And so I gave you all that background to set up because that is a little bit complicated, right? But the procedures, this section is going to go real smooth. So first and foremost, they did a minimal interpreter training with those interpreter participants. It wasn't like a full formal, like, let me teach you how to be an interpreter, just a basic review. One of the important points was make sure you're matching the tone and emotion of the speaker. Don't summarize the info, like you said, Rob, and then ask for clarification. If the speaker goes on too long, you may have a hard time interpreting, but they're learning, right? They gave them that information, so you can ask for clarification in those scenarios. Then after that, we jumped right into baseline 1. All of the remaining sessions were 5-minute sessions, I believe. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The probes with the caregivers are 5-minute sessions. There we go.
So originally they were supposed to be like negative 35 minutes.
No, they're just short. And I know I just told you that, but also later on, the sessions are 30 to 60 minutes. So maybe I have given myself some wrong info here. The sessions were 5 minutes, but they also bundled some of them together. So the graduate participants could have been in the training for 30 to 60 minutes at a time, but during that time, they actually fit in a bunch of sessions during that time.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So in baseline 1, all they said to the graduate participants was you are going to have a meeting with this caregiver. They do not speak English. An interpreter will be provided. And that's all they got. And so they checked to see, could they do those 5 things? And then in baseline 2, it was the same as baseline 1, except now they were given the checklist with those 5 target behaviors, but no definitions. After that, if participants were not able to demonstrate, then they moved into the BST, behavior skills training. It was just like you would imagine it to be. Important to note here, the caregiver wasn't present here, so it was a role play. The first author functioned as the caregiver during the BST, but the interpreter was there. And our first author was bilingual, so she was actually speaking Spanish during the meeting. As they progressed through the training, everything went hunky-dory, except for one participant. Like I said, they needed to add a visual cue. They put a finger up if she was starting to talk for too long. So after 4 seconds, and then after 7 seconds, she had to get cut off. But they were able to fade that out.
They didn't get one of those
yeah,
right?
You're doing too much.
Yeah.
Wrap it up.
Right, but it's so short. It's not that long. No. I understand why they did it. But it is something clearly I would have a harder time with. And then, in case you're curious, I can tell you the steps that the graduate student participants had a harder time with. They did an error analysis so that you can no, a little bit more. And I'll just choose baseline 2 since that was when they had the checklist. The errors were more commonly occurring in positioning the interpreter and speaking in simple sentences. So the last 3, speaking directly to the caregiver, that was rarely an error. Using non-technical language was very, very small, 3%. Ooh. And then repeating or clarifying was also rarely an error. So those 3 things most people were able to do from the beginning, but it was the first 2, where to position the interpreter, and that one about speaking in simple sentences, which is the short sentences, is really the key point there. Okay, so then BST went well, and then during the probes, those initial baseline probes, and then a post-training probe, where the same caregiver met with the participant again, exactly as before. They checked to see if the graduate student did everything, and then if they did it in 100% of 2 consecutive probes, then they had finished the study. At the end of each of those probes, the caregiver was given that comprehension questionnaire. So that was the secondary dependent measure. And then everybody got a social validity survey at the end. Yes. Everybody gets a survey.
You and you.
Exactly. And to quickly summarize the survey, the caregivers thought that things were great both before and after the training. Mm-hmm. But the author said maybe they were just being super nice. Yeah. Right?
Oh, you're so sweet.
I know. Right? I think there may have been some of that. They're like, well, they're really trying.
I believe they stated something around that they also, as part of doing this study, they'd move up the wait list too. And they mentioned that also
could be a
potentially played into it. If you don't want to be like, that was the worst service I ever had. I don't even want to be on your wait list anymore. Yeah. If it's going to look like this.
Yeah. And they said, culturally, some cultures might not want to like butt heads with. There's the word.
Yeah.
So that was that, but they did rate it well. Mm-hmm. For the interpreters, their satisfaction with the trainees' performance improved over time, and then graduate student satisfaction was high. And then the graph, everyone was relatively low in both of the initial baselines. For 2 of the 3 participants, having the checklist slightly improved their scores, but nowhere near mastery criterion. And then adding in the BST, which they list down here as rehearsal and feedback because the instructions were kind of the checklist.
That confused me initially, but then I had to read it again.
Yeah. Everyone got up to 100% independent with the one caveat that the one person needed the additional visual cue. And then in the post-training, they never needed more than just the 2 probes at the end. So BST very clearly generalized outside of the training setting to the actual caregiver setting, and it worked great. So it's a great example of how we can take a study like Doubly, where it just says, here's a list of recommendations, and then actually show other people how you can teach the skills listed in those recommendations. And they did it beautifully.
Yeah. I think weren't some of the responses to the questionnaire, to the listener comprehension questionnaire?
Oh, yeah.
Those weren't all as high as you would hope if everything was fully understandable.
Oh, yeah. I forgot to report on that.
That's true. You're right, Rob.
Which again, there's a lot of reasons that could happen. But, I think that points to the, part of it is that just having an interpreter doesn't necessarily mean you are being fully understood by
for sure.
The stakeholders, by clients. So, I think you're sort of hoping like, with the service, this is going to look great.
It's not always fully comprehended what happens in a meeting.
Yes.
Even if everyone is assumed to be a primary English language
speaker. I have that in those meetings.
Oh, yeah.
When I'm like, what just happened?
Right, what just happened?
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? Maybe all of us should have a comprehension questionnaire at the end of a meeting.
Oh my God, I would love that. And then I would actually pay attention to most meetings.
Yeah.
Just guided notes.
Right?
Well, yeah. I think it's great if after a meeting, especially one with a parent, if you can send a follow-up email with those bullet points in the top, right? Here's the notes from the meeting. Here are these bullet points. When we're meeting next, where it's going to be, what your homework is between now and then.
Right.
Yeah. Not a limitation of the study, limitation of meetings.
Yeah. Meetings in general.
Humans.
We'll have to do another podcast on meetings.
Yeah.
Now with new Zoom technology and AI assistive technology.
Yeah, I would like AI to get everything I said wrong. That'd be really awesome.
I just have to say this. So Diane and I had a meeting, and I was using AI because I love the summary at the end. When Zoom will transcribe the summary, and This was not a meeting about Diana and I talking.
No,
we literally
but no one else was there yet.
No one else was there. So we literally talked for like 2 minutes. And it was a full, like, big summary of the meeting. And it was titled Diana's Hair and Eye Issues. But the best part was it wasn't about her hair. It was about her husband, who is also her son's hair. It was awesome. It was all
I got
wrong.
confused on who I was talking about.
It got all wrong.
It made some assumptions.
Wow.
But it was glorious. I was kind of having a very sad day, and I was laughing so hard that I couldn't tell Diana
You were like in tears.
what was happening. I was like, I called her, and I was like... So, anyway.
AIs, it's our greatest humorists.
It was pretty funny.
All right. So, Jackie, we had one study that we discussed and looked at how parents kind of found the interpreter services. Let's do another one. Let's move to another section of the country. And by country, I mean different country.
When I found this article, I found it so fascinating. So this is written by some Swedish researchers. And the study was written in Sweden. And in Sweden, if you don't know, because I did not know, the law states that if you don't understand Swedish, it is required that someone give you an interpreter, right? I think that is the law here too.
It depends
It probably
on
depends.
the type of service.
Right.
Like if it's medical service or if it's an educational service, yes.
Yes, right. That's what they're talking about too.
But it's not like you go to the store. It's not like you're not required to.
No. Yeah. But I think it's the same in Sweden. So they said that healthcare workers in Sweden typically rely on family members to be the interpreters for their for their patients. And what they said is that usually patient care should be individualized and it should focus on the relationship between the healthcare provider, the interpreter, the family, as well as the patient. And it should be unbiased. We talked about that, right? And they said, but there are some advantages for using a family member, right? So if you're sharing confidential information, you're giving it to a family member, which may or may not be like better in the best interest for the client. They said that it might be better for support, right? Because then a family member knows what happened during and they can provide consultation and support afterwards. And they said that, like we found out, professional interpreters are actually more effective at bridging those communication barriers, right? Because they probably have training in the medical field and in the cultural.
Yeah.
So previous research looked at this question of using interpreter from the healthcare staff and patients side, but they never really looked at it for the adults' experiences of their family members using an interpreter in healthcare encounters. So this was not behavior analytic, putting it out there.
Right. No. Yeah.
Nope. And so they had focus groups of individuals, and they did a qualitative approach where we've had a few times we've talked about recently, where they had these focus groups. They originally started with 10, but it was too much. So then they went down to 3 to 4 people per focus group, and they asked them questions regarding their experience with interpreters, and then they looked for themes throughout the experience. Yeah. So the participants were Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. They were adults who spoke Serb-Croat who used an interpreter with a family member in healthcare. And they used this in Sweden because this represents the second largest immigrant group in Sweden. And I wanted to know what the largest one was, but I didn't look it up.
Oh.
But I thought about it, and then I didn't. They recruited through representation of the Migrants Association in the south of Sweden. Before they did anything, they had an information meeting at the Migrants Association town hall, it seemed like, where people heard about the study. They were provided informed consent and that the study was voluntary. The informed consent was both in Sweden and in their native language. They were given the informed consent in an envelope with the first author's addresses already on it with a postage. And they were like, you can mail this back if you want to be in it. So they couldn't even like drop it off. They had some time to think about it, right?
This says Syrian.
Oh, did I say it wrong?
No, that's the largest group.
Oh, I was like, did I screw it up?
Currently.
Oh.
Next up, Iraqi.
Okay, so it's different now.
Next up, Finland.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
So they had 2 men and 8 women participating in the study, aged 29 to 61 years of age. The median age was 45. It's like they were talking to me, but I'm not 45 yet. They had been in Sweden about 12 to 18 years, which is a long time. I thought. So the median was 17 years.
Yeah.
And they had different educational levels, 7 with the high school level and 3 with university education level, but all were refugees born outside of Sweden. So they did these 2 groups, and they asked the same questions. One of them had all women, one of them had the man in them.
Okay.
Right? Because that was happened. The data were collected between May and September of 2009. They used a semi-structured interview as a guide. It was translated into the native language so that it made sense for the participants, right? So they did not speak in Swedish. They spoke in their native language. And that was preferred by the informants. And the same investigator, the first author, was also a native speaker of both.
Oh, nice.
So he knew Swedish and Serbo-Croat. Yeah, so the questions they asked included, how do you perceive the use of interpreter with your loved ones? What went well? What could be improved?
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So they took notes, and the guy that started it took notes, but then they also they audio taped it. Is that what you call it? Voice recorded? Yeah. They used a cassette.
I know.
A tape deck. And they looked at the impressions of the topics discussed, interaction patterns, group dynamics, and level of participation. And non-communication was also registered. So this meeting took about an hour. And then they coded them. And so here's what they found. They said, again, it was so interesting. The 3 themes were experience of the use of interpreter, experience being used as an interpreter, and what needs to be improved. Okay. And none of them agreed on anything.
Oh, no.
So, but that's important to know, right? So their take-home point was amazing because they were like, it is important to understand the culture of which you're coming into to discuss and ask people what they prefer, right?
Great save on those data.
I know, right? They were like, some people found it beneficial for a family member because the family member would be able to communicate during this sensitive moment. Some people liked that it was the law and they could have a professional interpreter, but they did not like that the interpreter would give it to their families. So I guess in some cultures, interpreters should not give bad news to the patient. They should give it to the family member. And so if you didn't know that and you're giving it directly to the patient, that is a huge breach of trust. And it might be seen as lying or something going wrong, right? And so they said that you need to know that. Another thing they said was that the interpreter had to know the cultural traditions with the culture that they were interpreting, which makes sense. They said that they valued interpreters with education and knowledge in both language. They liked it if the interpreter was the same gender, around the same age as the patient, and which makes sense. Like, I don't want some young person
hearing about your old lady problems.
Yeah. No, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And this is healthcare too.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And they said professionalism was really important here. So they didn't want someone coming in with like a bra as a t-shirt. They wanted them to be dressed appropriately.
Again, old lady problems.
Oh, I know. I'm such an old lady around that. I mean, if I could wear a bra as a t-shirt, maybe I would. I just can't. But they did worry about confidentiality when using an interpreter because the random person's in the room.
Yeah.
Not knowing. They felt that they loved phone interpreters. They thought those were very positive because it masks some of the confidentiality.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. It's more anonymous.
But older generation preferred face-to-face. They liked it. If it was a mental health issue, they liked phone interviews. They said that if the visit was unexpected, if someone just showed up at the healthcare clinic, they never had a professional interpreter on staff. So that's where it'd be important, right? If you want to always take care of your clients, have one just in the building. Maybe they're doing something else too.
Yeah.
Maybe they're also a secretary or something.
Yeah, but that does seem very resource intensive.
Yeah.
Especially if you need Serbian, Syrian, Iraqi.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Got to have someone that's like super good in languages. And it was problematic that interpreters were not always booked or asked about during healthcare visits. So even though it was a law, people just assumed that they were going to use family members if family members came and didn't ask them if they actually wanted an interpreter. So experience being used as an interpreter for a family member, they said it's really nice. We can provide emotional support. During and after the consultation, we can ask additional questions, but it's also timely, takes away from their work, may be limited of their understanding because they also probably don't know Swedish medical technologies, right? They felt that they were blamed for expressing healthcare staff ideas to their family members, right? Like it was their fault. And it was different when
You're like, I'm going to have to tell them they have to eat healthier.
Right? And they're going to punch me, right? And it was especially difficult when it was bad news.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That all makes sense.
So what they said needs to be improved is that do not expect families to act as interpreters, even if that they're there. Collaboration should be better across all parties, and training in native languages and customs should occur more with interpreters because they should understand when they should tell patients versus when they should tell the family versus how they should tell people about bad news, whether if it's blunt or in a story. And so really the takeaway here is that it's really important to understand that culture really defines how people view illness. And it's really interesting that in some cultures, healthcare workers do not tell patients bad news, but tell their families. And that's something that I didn't think about because I didn't know. Yeah. And it's important to have the right dialect and language to increase trust. Yeah. And previous
Seems
research...
like a lot of places that things could go wrong.
Yeah. And it says that previous research showed that healthcare workers are not sure that families have told their loved ones the full brevity of bad news, right? They just may have skimmed over. And if you are always having to be the interpreter for your family member, it's going to take away from your time, your job, your money, your resources. So no one agreed on when or when not to use an interpreter or your family member, but they agreed that they should be asked and should look for an interpreter that the family would trust. Yeah.
And as the healthcare provider, you should not take for granted that someone could function as an interpreter for someone else.
And go like, oh my gosh, so thank you.
And like, you know, people may not have thought about all of these ins and outs.
I didn't. I was so surprised. Right. I would never think about having someone tell my mom and then have my mom tell me some bad news. Ew.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
But that's just my culture. Like, we've not done that. So
yes, exactly. So it's very illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, I think that brings us into Dissemination Station.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Train.
And I think one of the things that's nice about Dissemination Station on these tutorial episodes is because the take-home point is the thing we talked about that we said you need to do. Yep. So just to repeat, if you only remember one of the many things we talked about, probably want to start at the beginning by remembering to unpack your jargon, speak in simplified sentences about 7 seconds before waiting for the interpreter, allowing time for your meetings to elapse, maybe another 30 minutes, communicate to your clients that are using an interpreter, not to the interpreter. Be prepared to repeat or clarify your words, either because you are seeing body language that implies, oh no, no one understood what I just said, or because the interpreter has asked you to do so. Make sure that you think about the position of your meeting such that you can be looking right at your either client or stakeholder or family member, who, you know, whoever they are, kind of in the service you're providing, rather than the interpreter, so no triangles. And understand that the interpreter does serve many roles as an interpreter, including converting a message, which is the one we always think about, message clarifier. They're going to say what you say, but they have to understand that what you say might not make sense, either because of cultural reasons or because you just didn't make any sense. They'll also be the cultural clarifier in general.
Always
so
possible.
Thinking about cultural considerations. So they might do some translation there if you use a phrase that isn't, you know, literal translation won't make any sense. And also serving as an advocate for the client in terms of, is the client uncomfortable? Does something seem like it's not coming through for the client? That kind of an advocate. They're not going to be talking about the types of services you are offering or how you're,
sped law.
what. Yeah, they're not going to talk about sped law, or like, that's not the assessment I would use for a behavior problem of this magnitude. So just in terms of the comfort. And you could take a look at...
It's a lot of job.
Yeah, it's a lot to do. It's very busy. And the Dowdy It All checklist, you can take a look at that if you want to improve your reflection processes and demonstrate to the interpreter you're working with that you value what they are doing and you value their role on the team and you are interested in doing a good job, even though you know you might not do a good job today. You will try to do a better one tomorrow. Any other big take-homes that...
Consider culture. When you are picking an interpreter and using an interpreter, remembering that even though it's not specifically in the ethics code, it is an ethical obligation for behavior analysts to make sure that their clients understand assessment and treatment options. And so using an interpreter is the ethical route if you have a family that is not speaking the same language as you as a primary language.
All right. And let's wrap it up with pairings.
All right. It's time for Pairings. Pairings is the part of the show where I tell you about past episodes that you might want to check out if you found this one interesting. So we have never talked about this quite in this way, but we do have several episodes that are at least tangentially related. So the first one that came to mind for me was episode 243, where he talked about DEI research applications in the Batty lab with Dr. Sarah Lachago. This exact study wasn't in there, but there were some similar ones that we did talk about. So her lab is doing great work in this area. Also, you could check out episode 71, where we discuss cultural competence with Dr. Slandy Forte, episode 104, where we discuss culturally aware assessment with Dr. Elizabeth Hughes Fong, episode 152, we talked about ethics of teaching cultural responsiveness. That was just with ourselves. Episode 287, teaching compassionate care to trainees. Is guess what? BST is also going to be used there. And that is a supervision episode if people are looking for that. And then very recently, episode 309, we talked about family supports and contextualized treatment planning, which is also going to be underneath the cultural/ethics category too, as are some of these other ones, actually. Yeah, maybe all of these are.
I do want to say that I say that. If people are looking, when they look at our previous episodes, we do have a section in previous episodes just called cultural. We did not rename them to be cultural/ethics or put them twice. We have thoughts on that, but that's where it was. We put that in the cultural section because we also do,
I think it does say cultural/ethics.
I might have put a /ethics just to be in line with it.
Well, to clarify, there's an ethics category.
Yes.
And then there's a cultural/ethics category.
That's nice.
Yes. So if you're using it as
depending on where you need to submit them, it'll say everything that you need on the certificate, depending on where that needs to go. But the ones in the cultural/ethics category are many of the ones I just mentioned, in fact, and all touch on these or similar topics. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I like to recommend a snack to go with the episode. And so today I am recommending a variety of snacks, including chai tea, these lovely rosewater candies.
My most favorite.
Yeah. And some delicious baklava, which were all snacks that were offered to me in meetings with families of varying different cultural backgrounds, and at which at the time I was supposed to say no. But
you didn't.
Still ate some of them anyway, because it is way worse, I think, regarding the rapport with the family to refuse to participate.
So the recent code, though, Diana, when were you offered those snacks? What's the statute of limitations here? I can neither confirm nor
deny when I did those things. Yeah, but it was good. Okay. Good snacks. So.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening to our tutorial on working with an interpreter. We really appreciate you listening and subscribing to ABA Inside Track on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can find us online at abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to all of the episodes Diana described in pairings, as well as all of our older episodes, and links to purchase CEs. If you want to get the second secret code word, well, keep on listening. I'm going to give that to you in just a second.
Oh, no.
Dang, I pulled the rug out from under there. But before you get a second secret code word, why not think about whether you would love to join us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get all of your episodes a week ahead of time, as well as get access to our polls. We do a quarterly poll for listener choice episodes where we give a couple topics and you pick which one we do, and you get a free CE for that. Or you can subscribe at the $10 level to get access to our book clubs right when they come out. Those are 2-hour-long discussions of a variety of books. At the time of this recording, we are almost, I think actually in a couple weeks, we'll be releasing our newest book club, The Body Keeps the Score, on trauma. And we also have our poll for what books we'll be doing next year. We just looked at the list, and it is quite a good list. You don't want to miss out on those, as well as the 2 CEs you get for free for being a patron, just as a thank you. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And finally, we want to give you a couple big thanks. But before we give those big thanks, I want to give you that second secret code word. It is cigar. Cigar.
Can you say that for everyone again?
Cigar.
No, say it normal.
Cigar.
Cigar.
Cigar. Cigar. Cigar. And now back to our very special thanks. And those are to Dr. Jim Carr for
the
recording
Marlboro Corporation.
Our intro. Yuck. They don't make cigars. Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye!